Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Level Up webinar. I am Michaela, joined by Marissa, and we are on Cloud 9 to be chatting today with you all about the cloud. If you're new to our Level Up series, we host one webinar per month designed around a different topic each time to help business leaders strategically level up their business game. Before we kick things off, though, I do want to mention a few quick things, and then we will get started. These are pre-recorded conversations. However, we are here live with you in the chat box. So please feel free to ask any questions that you think of throughout the webinar so that we can answer them for you directly. And one other thing before we get going, this webinar will be available as a recording after the fact. So you'll get a link via email with the recording that you're more than welcome to share with other people inside your office or your network that you think would benefit from it. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be focusing on the cloud, and you've probably heard us mention that word quite a few times, along with seeing it pop up in your everyday tasks. Side note, if you're curious, we do have a short video where Marissa gives a brief overview of the cloud in less than 60 seconds that you can check out. Today, though, we're going to be talking about making that shift to the cloud and understanding the different options to help your organization adopt the right cloud technologies. So with all of that being said, let's get started.
Let's level up.
All right, so we're going to kick things off with cloud technology and focusing on what that really means for your small business and thinking about things that you'll need in order to make the move and also things to consider when it comes to the tools you're going to use. So let's start by making sure that we're all on the same page. So the cloud is a shorter way of saying that your technology lives somewhere else, which requires an internet connection. There's still hardware and software involved, of course, but it lives somewhere else.
That's right. And there's lots of options, but for small businesses, it typically means a couple of different things. One, cloud backups and recovery solutions. So think of this as backups for your files or your computers, backups for Microsoft 365, which we've never talked about before. Just kidding. We talk about it all the time. And then solutions like Azure Site Recovery, where you have cloud technology available if your systems are down locally and you have your servers spin up in a virtual environment. There's also this kind of section of software as a service, which is a lot of us are familiar with for like business applications, file sharing and storage. Microsoft 365 is a great example of this. It's a subscription model. It typically is based on the number of seats or licenses, and then usually some add-ons are available as well. But then there's this category that maybe we haven't talked about as much, which is the cloud hosting for applications or servers themselves. Maybe you've heard of public cloud. That is a cloud environment that the infrastructure is actually not owned by you, your organization. It's owned and maintained somewhere else. So think Microsoft Azure. They carve out resources for your organization. This is that pay-as-you-go model you might have heard before. So you pay for the resources that you use, which is nice when you scale. Private cloud is a different option, which gives you more control. So this is typically good for organizations that need a better, like even more availability and control around that, or control around security for things like business, government, or regulatory compliance. You don't share resources with other people. So it's a different need than for the public cloud. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of cloud computing, let's talk about practical usage for small businesses based on experiences with our clients.
And a very common question that small businesses have, or they want to know what all should be moved to the cloud. I mean, they have all these different things. Like, do you put everything there? Do you put some things? So what do they move?
That's a great question. And, you know, the answer could be everything. But low-hanging fruit, easy options for small businesses to get their toes wet with the cloud are things like moving your email system. So going from having Exchange on a server in your office to having hosted Exchange or Exchange Online through Microsoft 365. Another thing, which I'm sure you've never heard of before, is hosted phone options. So voice over IP, things like Nextiva, where you can get a cloud phone solution, or even Microsoft Teams has phone solution options. So you replace the traditional phone connection with calls over the internet. Collaboration software like Microsoft 365, Slack, even some of the hosted phone services have their own kind of communication and collaboration platform. And then, of course, files. File storage and sharing has been changed with the way that the cloud offers storage based on the affordability of it and the accessibility of it. And so cloud file storage like OneDrive or SharePoint or Box, those are solutions, software as a service solutions that are easy to take advantage of. Also, when you think about moving components to the cloud, you want to back up. And so that's another thing that small businesses should think about with moving to the cloud, backup for files. One of a great use case right now is that typically we used to tell folks to back up their workstations, back up to their laptops. If they're moving around the office, out of the office, and they're not saving files in a place like on a server that's backed up, instead of backing up that computer and having the files live there, move your files to something like OneDrive and then back up OneDrive. So we're changing a little bit of the behavior, but those are the most common and easiest ways to start taking advantage of the cloud if you're not already.
So kind of circling back to what should be moved, should small businesses move their servers to the cloud?
This is my favorite question. It's a good planning question for as your server ages. So you have a server in your office. We typically say they have a lifespan of about 5 years. So as it starts to hit that 5-year mark, you're talking about refreshing the hardware. Consider moving it to the cloud. Of course, that's going to depend on the use case, but I can offer you guys some pros and cons generally. And this is going to focus on the public cloud specifically. So pros, there's no initial or upfront capital expenditure, and there's no need for those system refreshes, right? Because the infrastructure the physical infrastructure isn't maintained by you any longer. It's somewhere else. It's also easy to scale as you grow and your needs change. You can add resources as you need to, so you don't have to commit until you need them. It also gives you access to technology from anywhere, right? Which also leads to secure and simple file sharing solution. There's also this availability or uptime guarantees, and it ultimately less risk for the server to go down than if it were in your own office. Those guarantees don't work the same when you have your own infrastructure in your office versus in the cloud. The downside of it, because there are, there are ongoing fees. When you have a physical server, those hardware costs are going to eventually be paid and be done. And so you're paying for those in refresh cycles, whereas having a public cloud like an Azure is going to cost you ongoing for as long as you use the stuff. It's also if your business isn't dependent on that critical uptime and you don't have a lot of remote employees, the cost can outweigh the benefits. So it's always that ROI is important. And with that being said, the cloud isn't necessarily a cost-saving measures. It's usually some of those other benefits that lead people to go towards the cloud. We also mentioned earlier, Michaela said, internet connection. You have to connect to these resources over the internet. So if you have an internet outage, you no longer have access to the infrastructure or the applications or whatever you're using, the technology. Also, communicating over the network or working in the office and connecting to the server that's in the office doesn't require an internet connection. And it is pretty fast. When you're connecting to the cloud through the internet, there's also some performance degradation that can happen. And there are some solutions to help clean up that traffic. But that is, there could be some latency or some slowness or performance issues when comparing accessing it locally versus like that, hands locally and in the cloud. Before I finish on this question, hybrid approach is an option, and it does help you blend the benefits of having that cloud agility, flexibility, all that, while reducing the responsibilities of your on-premise infrastructure. A lot of small businesses are already using Azure Active Directory to sync with a in-office server that's running Active Directory. That is for what we call identity access and management. That is happening so that you can extend the security over the access that you have, the control of access over your files and your technology. You're transmitting that or copying it over, extending it to the cloud so that you can maintain that same level of security throughout your cloud resources. Another example of a hybrid approach would be moving, let's say you have an application that all of a sudden has an increased demand, and it's becoming really critical to you. You can move that application to the cloud while keeping some of the other infrastructure on premise so you can support that increased demand and have that scalability.
Okay. Not that you haven't talked enough about the server yet, but naturally, I do have another question about your server. So with the move to the cloud, can I get rid of my server?
This is my favorite answer. Potentially. Servers for small businesses have a couple of functions. Typically, storing files. We've already talked about that. There's an easy, low-hanging fruit solution for storing files. Running applications. If you have a software that lives on a server in your office, that is an option of whether or not you move to a cloud like software as a service alternative, or you could potentially move it to the cloud and run on infrastructure like a server built in the cloud through Azure. It also does what I mentioned before, which is that identity access and management, which is that kind of broad security for users accessing your data, for devices accessing your data. That's your domain security. When you're in the office and you log into the network to get access to the server resources, or if you have to connect to a VPN to get into, that is all typically controlled by an on-premise server. Now, there are lots of solutions. You can build a patch, kind of a combination of all of these things, or you can simply have your domain controller in the cloud. But the goal here is simplicity. And there are lots of solutions that can help you get to a purely cloud environment. But keep in mind that simplicity is the key. And so reviewing your business's needs before making that decision and thinking about the future and the plan is going to be really critical in deciding whether or not you can get rid of a server.
So yes and no.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, that is all we have for tools in the cloud. Stay tuned for our next segment. We will be chatting all things cybersecurity in the cloud. The next piece we're going to look at is security. Cybersecurity should always be top of mind, especially in today's cyber world where hacks and scams are constantly evolving and increasing. And just because you put things in the cloud doesn't mean that they aren't vulnerable to those same cyber attacks. And the shift to the cloud has allowed for so much more flexibility, especially in the hybrid workplace, but that increase in flexibility and access requires new considerations when it comes to securing your data. There are three major risks that we'll focus on today, starting off with the risk of accessibility. So the risk of accessibility is basically where the internet gives everyone an opportunity to attempt to log into your systems. And if you don't have the right cybersecurity defenses in place, then your things are at risk.
That's right. And so from VPNs to conditional access to multi-factor authentication, there's a shift now in how we secure these access to the cloud. 5 years ago, we talked about your security as needing to secure your office network. And that perimeter of that network was your office, and a firewall and antivirus was all that we needed. But now, when our things are in the cloud and accessible by the internet, it means that we have to extend that security or that perimeter in order to make sure that we give the same attention to the pieces that we're logging into in the cloud. And so VPNs allow us to log into the secure network at the office to connect to those resources. Conditional access is the concept of limiting where you are able to access or requiring certain conditions to be met in order to access. So that helps to control logins from geographic, from places that aren't where your employees should be logging in from. It could just mean that the type of device needs to be a certain thing in order to access your infrastructure. It could also mean that while you're in the office, you don't require multi-factor authentication because you're in the office. And then multi-factor authentication, which we've talked about a lot, which is once somebody gets the ability to potentially access your stuff, if they get your password, they can't log in because there's another factor for authentication to stop them before they come in. And then of course, when we talk about access, we also talk about passwords and how they should be strong, but also be made to be easy. So password managers, single sign-on, these are all solutions that allow you to make strong passwords simple for your end users. Because if it's not simple, they're not going to do it, which means you're at risk. And then, limiting permissions and access. We've talked about this before. Principle of least privilege, which is basically saying you're going to get access. All of your employees are going to get access to the minimum of what they need in order to do their jobs, so that you're not giving potential access, broader access, which reduces your risk of accidental exposure. It's also when you're talking about limiting access and permissions, it's also good that we don't use admin accounts to do our daily operations. We only use the admin accounts for the increased privileges that we would need for those functions. And the idea, like Michaela said, is that we're reducing the risk for accessing, for the wrong people accessing your systems.
There's also this risk of online threats. With the cloud being connected through the internet, cyber criminals are lurking all over the internet, whether it be on websites, even if it's a legit site that you think you've been on before, or it looks normal, or even in your inbox through phishing emails. They're everywhere. So you have to be prepared and know what can help you prevent these hackers from getting in.
And one of the best ways to do that is to educate your employees and yourself so that you understand what those potential risks look like, so you can help play a part in this cyber defense team. But then when we talk about technology, comprehensive endpoint security, this will help you defend against sophisticated attacks like ransomware. So what do I mean by comprehensive endpoint security? Traditional antivirus is good in detecting the viruses and the malware that we have identified and know exist. Having a more modern antivirus component that allows you to also detect bad things based on the way they behave to help stop threats before they're identified. So you're closing the holes. So the time that let's say the virus was born to the time it's identified, there's a gap with traditional antivirus. Modern antivirus covers that gap and adds on that traditional protection that we have relied on for years. Another component of endpoint security is also what we would call DNS security. And what that does is it protects your users and their machines from online threats. So let's talk about ransomware. Ransomware is something that you download, and once it's downloaded and it is triggered, it calls back. So it uses the internet to go back to its home to get keys to encrypt your data. DNS filtering can see that behavior going over the internet and can block it from happening. So it stops the ransomware from actually encrypting your files. So layering on that kind of technology along with your advanced antivirus, you're going to get so much more coverage from potential threats. Moving on, security monitoring. This is the idea of you've got cyber security systems in place. Now it's time to make sure that those are working properly so that you can detect potential issues and respond faster. So this is going, you might hear it called endpoint detection and response, or EDR, and some providers offer it as a managed detection and response or managed threat response or SOC as a service. The whole idea is that it's managed security for detecting and responding to threats. And then, just know your vulnerabilities. So doing things like risk assessments and paying attention to which security patches need to be implemented is going to help make sure that you're plugging any potential holes that online threats can get into.
For sure. And thirdly, there's also, as always, a risk of data loss. And you've definitely heard us talk about this a time or two before, but it's definitely a practice that is worth repeating. You have to back up your data regularly. And that way, if something were to happen, obviously we can take all these preventative measures, but you're never fully immune to everything. If something were to happen, your backups can greatly decrease the downtime and the cost to your organization that losing your data would cause. And as Marissa mentioned, with knowing your vulnerabilities, you should also be testing your backups regularly. And that way, your vulnerabilities within your backups as well. If you think that everything is backing up normally and you can recover everything, that might not be the case when it's actually put to use. So making sure that everything you need is being backed up and in a timely manner is a way to help save your business lots of downtime too.
Absolutely.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the actual migration process to the cloud. There's a few different things we will cover here. So first, we're going to talk about some of the benefits of moving to the cloud. So one, obviously scalability. As your business grows, the cloud grows with you, and it's very easy to adapt to the size of your organization and your needs as you grow. Number two is the flexibility. As we've probably already seen, most of us in this hybrid workplace, the flexibility that the cloud brings with everyone being able to access what they need from wherever they're working makes a world of a difference when it comes to getting things done and employee happiness and all the things. And number three, productivity, kind of tying back into the flexibility one. With people being able to access the things they need from anywhere and being able to collaborate and work together, things get done a lot faster. And whether everyone's in the office or everyone's at home or a mix of the two, you don't have to worry about whether or not your team can work together on things that need multiple people involved. And lastly, a benefit is staying competitive. You've probably seen a lot of organizations moving to the cloud and making that migration. And so to stay up with everyone else, making that move is a huge competitive factor for your small business. On the flip side, though, there are a few common challenges. So the first one, not using an IT consultant along the way. So someone like us can help advise your business and help with kind of seeing what exactly your business needs and how the cloud, which tools to use and which would make the most sense for you. And it could help you prevent a lot of issues down the road. Secondly, it has to be properly implemented as you make the switch to the cloud once you get started, and kind of keeping up monitoring to make sure that everything is working properly. If not, your cloud migration can actually end up costing more money. You could lose data, or you could create a ton of security holes without really knowing you're even doing so. And again, going back, it's not always cheaper. If you end up creating security holes or you lose data, or, something isn't done correctly in the migration process, it could end up costing a lot more money. And lastly, as always, new technology always brings a learning curve to your employees. If you don't make the effort to train your users and let them know what's coming and how it will affect what they do on a daily basis, they may be hesitant to jump on board, which could cause some issues as well. So you should be sure and take those educational steps both beforehand, before you make the migration, and then also throughout the process as well, to continue to train and keep them informed while you're making sure that everything is working smoothly. Now we're going to touch on the actual migration process. So it's a pretty simple, you have the roadmap, now you just need to act on it. So you're working together and collaborating with your IT partner, figuring out exactly what your small business needs and what will best fit those needs, and you create the solid plan. The next step is actually making the move. So again, alongside your IT partner, you will make the actual migration process. And then lastly, as we mentioned before, just the ongoing maintenance and monitoring help both on when it comes to the actual cloud migration process, and also on your employee side to make sure that everything is running smoothly, everyone's happy, knows what they're doing, knows how to use it, and to prevent further issues down the road.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and that you learned a little something about the cloud. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to send them in the chat now and we will answer them for you. You can also contact either Marissa or myself at our emails listed here on the screen. We are always looking for suggestions and topic ideas that you all want to hear about, so feel free to send us any feedback. You can also check out our latest episode of Marissa Explains It All, as Marissa explains how to choose the right firewall for your business. Stay tuned for registration details coming out soon for our next webinar later this month. And with that, thank you all again for hanging out with us today as we broke down the cloud, and we will see you next time.
See you soon.